severiformin's been extinct since the Cretaceous period. I mean, this thing is about this thing. What?
Hey, Mad Minions, welcome again to another episode. We've got Cowboy Jack here back, and hopefully he will give us a little rundown at first about his upcoming game. I saw some of your stuff on Dial the Dice. When is your Kickstarter going live, sir? Well, enough about that then. First, we're going to have a commercial break. We'll be right back. Hey, welcome back. Our first topic of today is why fantasy? Obviously, fantasy, like most RPGs and video games are fantasy. Why do you think that is?
Well, Matt Overlord, that's a very interesting question because it's not the most fantasy is not the most popular genre with film and television. Yet with RPGs, it's the staple almost. Well, it is the staple. So I think that's why it's an interesting question, because with the public, it's not the most popular genre. However, with the RPG crowd, it clearly is. Why?
What is the most popular? Like probably cop shows.
Yeah. I mean, my goodness, how many Law and Orders and forensic files kind of stuff,
But I think
perhaps,
fantasy. Oh, go ahead.
Well, could it perhaps be the way it translates to a tabletop RPG versus any other genre? I've never thought about that, but maybe therein lies the answer.
Well, I think just like the appeal of Star Wars is like Jedi, because you get to use a lightsaber. There's something to be said about being up close and personal in combat. You get to beat somebody with a sword. You get to sling a spell. Where like something like military or cowboys, you're stuck with your 6-shooter, and you can't really go. A 6-shooter only does so much damage. You have to get better. Where like in fantasy, you start off with a goof with a club, then you get a sword, then you get a magic sword, then you get a better magic sword. So it definitely appeals to like the more power gamer to us. Medieval times was a very hard time, so people had to struggle, but it wasn't like caveman days where you still had to like scratch out a living. You still had food available, but there's an angry robber baron in the next town over. Let's go beat him up. And so that kind of, and you don't have to do things like build a spaceship and stuff like that. So I think that's why it has a lot of appeal. It's simple enough to be simple, but it's not at a point where you'll starve to death. And even though I think in a good fantasy RPG, you should be able to starve to death and have plague and all that stuff, but that's just me.
Yeah, so maybe that's part of the translation, because that what you've just mentioned, that can be easily contained within the tabletop.
Yeah.
The world in the tabletop, the battle map, so to speak. So yeah, maybe that's why. Maybe that's part of it. And there is something, kind of romantic about the sword.
Mm-hmm.
A very iconic survival weapon. Takes skill to use it. So yeah, maybe that's why, because it translates to the tabletop in such a way.
Another thing that you just hit on is the fact that in an RPG, you can put as much stuff in it as you want. So in the fantasy genre, you can have, if you want like lots of disease and make things harder, you can do that. If you want to make it like a little bit like easier, where you just want to go kill some goblins and make it easy, you can do that. in fantasy, the DM can kind of tailor the world how they want to.
No, I think that's probably our strongest point we've made so far. I think that's probably the best guess of all the options we've had so far.
So
Because, as you said, the creativity aspect is so much more open and easily produced when you're using the fantasy setting. For instance, if you're in the Wild West or if you're in the 1920s, to actually pull it off and be convincing, even partially to the group you're playing with, you do have to know something about that genre, something about the history during that time. Whereas in fantasy, no history is required, really.
and the DM can kind of tailor make it. If they want to have like a thief campaign, they can. If they want to have like lots of magic, they can. Which brings us to the next segment, which right after this.
I'll fight you.
Neville, I'm really, really sorry about this.
Hey, we're back. And so the next topic is low magic or high magic. So when I run a D&D campaign, as you know, I do very low magic. I like the fact that the players have to, what's the word I'm looking for? They have to actually
work for it.
Yeah, they have to solve problems themselves. Magic is like, oh, there's a bunch of goblins, I just drop a fireball on them. And then we'll just heal up. Bim, bam, boom. But in a low magic world, you have to sit there and go like, oh, can we take these goblins? You always have to kind of think if you can, even if like you're powerful, you still have to kind of think about your next encounter. It's not just like beat everything up. So what do you think, sir? Low magic, high magic?
Yeah.
Hey, that's that topic.
Well, it's refreshing to talk to you about this because my other long distance buddy that I talk with very regularly, George, if you're watching, hey George, I'll make sure George sees at least this episode. But yeah, George, he prefers the high magic, which is fine. That's his taste. So we have this conversation pretty often. Of course, I take the stance of low magic. And I've thought about that quite a bit in those conversations I've had with George. And here's my thoughts on that.
Okay.
I prefer low magic because for the same reasons that you do. I like folks to have to work a little harder. I think it's more interesting of a story when you don't start off with everybody, you're throwing several spells a day. I think magic is more appreciated when it's not every day that a character would see that happen.
Yeah.
It's a special occasion. Oh, we've heard of people that do that, and there's one now. Ooh, that's a big deal. And I've narrowed it down to why I think that's my preference. I believe it's because my early introduction to fantasy was low magic TV, film, books, stories, things like that. For instance, Rankin Bass, the animated Hobbit.
Oh, those are awesome.
Yeah, there was dragons. Yeah, there were wizards, but it was very, very earthly, very realistic, very grainy, very tangible. Okay, of course it was based on it's Tolkien's Middle Earth, so of course. But then you carry that over. Also, early influences for me, the original Conan. That movie, if you really look at it, that movie is very low magic. It's kind of I call it that gritty realism that made the characters and the story tangible for me to be immersed in. The same with Beastmaster. Beastmaster's got plenty of magic in it, but it's not over the top kind of magic. There's just a little here and there, just enough to make it fantasy. But anyway, long story short, those are the kinds of early influences I had into the fantasy genre. So I think that's probably why those were some big influences for me.
That's what makes magic magical. So think of
I
like
like that statement.
in
That's
the
what makes magic magical.
think of like in modern day. So if you see this weird metal box coming down the street with like four wheels and nothing's powering it, you're like, oh my gosh, what is that? Well, to us, we know it's an automobile. But if you put an automobile and it's like commonplace. Everybody knows about it. But if you put an automobile like 100 years ago, people are like, wow, that's amazing, a horseless carriage. Same thing to me with like magic in a campaign. If there's so much magic that everybody's like, it loses its magicalness, magic thingy. Because if magic becomes so common that everybody sees it daily, it's no longer magic. It's just like another daily tool. And I would rather keep magic magical. Where like if somebody walks into the town and drops a fireball, you're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Everybody run for the hills. But if magic is so common that, oh, here comes a guy in a robe and a staff, grab the bucket brigade because we know the tavern's going to probably burn down again. Then it's kind of like it loses something. I mean, it really does.
Yeah, you're in a busy tavern, a roadside tavern. You go in, and there's a dozen men at arms. There's about half that wizardly robe types. There just happens to be like 5 or 6 different clerics on duty that night. I mean, to me, it's not special when you're doing that. So I like to give a lot of realism when I can, and then the magic, give it a little hint. Now maybe at the climax when they finally caught up with the Lich Lord that's been controlling the whole scenario the whole time. Okay, throw fireballs, have your lightning bolts and all that. But just walking down the street and every other shop sells potions. Come on.
Yeah. Well, I think
I sound like I'm knocking it. I don't knock it. It's just not my preference.
yes, same here. If people want to play that way, more power to you. I'm glad because that's one of the great things about the topic we were just talking about. In RPGs, you can tailor it how you want. You can tailor.
Oh my gosh.
But
think about this. I mentioned one of my early influences was the original Conan the Barbarian, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if one of my earliest influences would have been the rebooted Conan the Barbarian? I probably would be a high fantasy nut.
Yeah. Well, if you're a fan of the new Conan, I probably wouldn't be talking to you. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I completely agree with you that and also too it makes creating adventures easier with low magic because so if there's like a charlatan doing like dirty card tricks in a tavern, well, in D&D, I forget which I think it's a clerical spell like detect lie. You can just cast detect lie on him, bam. You know that he's trying to fool you. Boy, that's a lot of fun.
How about the real stale party killer, which was detect alignment? Remember that one?
Yeah.
And no alignment? Yeah.
Well, that's like a whole nother topic for another show because we go actually, yeah, like maybe next week we'll do a question on alignment.
Now, what about you, Matt Overlord? Now, I kind of mentioned some of my early influences, and I give that credit for my taste I have today. Do you give your personal taste in the low magic thing credit to anything particular?
Very similar to yours. Not the Conan movies, but the Conan books. I was an avid Robert E. Howard fan. Oh my gosh, I still am to this day. In fact, he's probably one of the biggest influences on my writing. It's like high adventure. It's so much fun. This swashbuckling guy going around having adventures. To me, that's what the essence of D&D is about.
My brother had those Conan books, like you're talking about, but I wasn't allowed to bother him. He'd get mad if I'd go in his room.
Oh my gosh. Go if you can find like the Robert E. Howard stuff, go read some of his stuff.
Hey,
like
what Frank Frazetta did for those books was amazing.
Yeah. But the books themselves, because the artwork's great, but the books behind them is even better. Like I recommend like the Conan books, and if you can find the stuff on Solomon Kane was also a very huge influence on. Actually, you'll find so in the stories I write, you'll find that Solomon Kane is a huge influence. Where like Conan, and he's a brute. Solomon Kane is just this like uncaring guy in an uncaring world with like witches and devils and stuff, and so it's very heavily influenced. So that's probably my biggest influence on like how I run games is Conan. We'll be back after this.
And it's a natural thing, of course. I mean, I could work out all day, and obviously I'm an ex-athlete myself.
Hey, we're back, and for the final topic of the day. So you were an older gentleman. Do you remember those like commercials with the like the cereal commercials, like with Fruity Pebbles and Trix Rabbit and Lucky Charms? So those guys were always trying to steal your cereal. So if they stole your cereal, what would you do? How would you murder them? And how would you do it?
Well, thanks to Lucky Charms, that was an early influence. So thanks to Lucky Charms, I can still manage a crazy Irish accent even today, you know. Don't you know? So if Lucky were to steal my Lucky Charms, is that the question you're asking?
Yeah, any of them.
Lucky was to steal my Lucky Charms? I'd be pretty upset. I would hope that he would at least leave some marshmallows. If he didn't, I would probably find the nearest rainbow and hide out and try to catch him. Try to catch him not paying attention and get my Lucky Charms back. If the rabbit Trix took my Trix, I would have to contact my long distance buddies, and we would just go rabbit hunting, whether it was wabbit season or not, and try to get the Trix back.
You wascal, you wabbit. Yeah, call up Elmer Fudd.
Yeah, I went to Elmer Fudd. But you know, my favorite cereal back in the 70s, 80s, I think it disappeared in the 80s, but I remember it in the 70s. Quisp. Do you remember Quisp?
I remember Quisp.
Had the little alien with like a weird thing on his head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Quisp was my favorite cereal, period, hands down.
Gosh,
but it eventually disappeared. I wasn't very old when we stopped being able to find it, but
yeah,
it was my fave.
I remember having it a couple times, but not many. I don't
Fruity
even remember.
Pebbles. I love Fruity Pebbles.
I think my favorite was probably Boo Berry. Anything that like turns your poop blue can't be a bad thing.
Oh yeah, the Frankenberry, the Boo Berry, Count Chocula, but I like the Boo Berry and Frankenberry better.
Yeah, but so like for me, like Barney Rubble was such a short little guy. You could just pick him up and like throw him in a wood chipper. You'd just be like, "Quit stealing my Fruity Pebbles," and just throw him in a wood chipper, and he'd be done.
Wait, I got to challenge you on that though. As you know, with the Flintstones, everything was Stone Age technology. So if you're going to throw them in the wood chipper, how would that work? What's that look like?
It would probably just be like a dinosaur that would chew up trees, you know? And so they'd just throw in.
And it digests really quickly, so he shoots out the other end.
I don't know about that, but no, they'd just be like two dinosaurs going nom 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 nom, and you'd stick in a log and it'd just turn into like wood chips.
Okay, yeah, that's very Flintstone-y.
Yeah, so there's Barney Rubble in there. The Trix Rabbit, yeah, I'd probably just do what you did and get like a hunter friend, and then sell them to China because like rabbit head is a delicacy there. In Chengdu where I used to live, they would just take a rabbit head, cut it off, and like deep fry it and then eat it. I have never done that. I don't want any food that's looking at me. And I think like the cookie crook, I would just call the police. Just call 911.
Cookie crisp.
You'll find in the editing of this that I've had to string together like maybe like 10 clips because our connection is just awful today. My connection is awful. So I think we should end it there. Hey, sir, it's great to have you back. Another great show.
Hey, did you notice I had I had plenty of energy. I had plenty of energy tonight.
Sweet. I didn't have any energy, but I'm putting the finishing touches on a second book, and that's just got me exhausted these days.
Yeah.
But on that happy note, hey everybody, stay mad, be good.
All the other king, kita pampana kit to veteran, throw my gun. All the other king, kita pampana kit to veteran, faster than my gun.